Tell me exactly, briefly, what the Army Corps of Engineers does.
Well, the Corps of Engineers is a federal agency which is primarily civilian, and we do a number of things that are all water related. We do shoreline protection projects, harbor dredging, flood control, military construction as well, and we also have a regulatory division which does environmental permitting pursuant to a section of the Clean Water Act called Section 404, which is related to dredge and fill activities, place and fill in wetlands or waters.
And where do you all come into play when it comes to building the roads?
Well, whenever a road project has got to pass through a wet habitat, be that crossing a river or going through a wetland, swampy area, if that cannot be avoided, then the permit is required. We're involved quite early on. Typically, when they're planning a project and designing a project, they will come to us to get what's called a jurisdictional determination. They will look at the proposed right-of-way and alignment for the project and have us help them determine, are there wetlands or other waters of the U.S. in this alignment, and if so, are they under our jurisdiction, and would they require permitting if they cannot be avoided. So we're involved early on, and then further into the design there will be an actual permit application for whatever impacts are unavoidable.
Define what a wetland is exactly.
Well, a wetland is literally a special habitat, a special category of waters of the U.S., and a wetland is an area that has this combination of hydraulic, the presence of water, hydric soils, and hydrophytic wetland vegetation. And when we find habitats that have that combination of three parameters, we call them, then we recognize that as a wetland. And we spend a lot of our time helping property owners, not just the highway department, but everybody, identify whether they have wetlands on a property and what's the extent of their. In South Carolina, the low country, of course, is famous, and the low country is primarily wet areas. We're very, very low in the landscape. And Charleston District, in fact, as a Corps of Engineers district, is one of the smaller districts in size, but the proportion of wetlands that are found in the Charleston District is much higher than pretty well anywhere in the country.
So when we say a permitting process before they build this road, what needs to be permitted?
Well, actually, literally what requires the permit is the permission to place fill material into the water or into the wetland area. And, you know, of course, our permitting process is designed to try and minimize the amount of that that's needed. We help look at ways to avoid impacts or to minimize impacts when they're not avoidable, and we literally help the applicant, in this case the highway department or the county highway department, we help them look for alternatives that involve fewer impacts. So we hope that when we issue a permit, it is for the least environmentally damaging alternative that can be identified and still meet their needs. We permitted the Palmetto Commerce Parkway recently. We've been involved with some work on Beast Ferry. The Johnny Dodds Boulevard project had some wetland impacts. They're in construction now. And those are all Charleston County funded projects. We normally try to work with an applicant to see that their project, if it's got a legitimate need, that the project can be permitted. And of course, sometimes that involves some pretty serious revisions to the project. But we have denied permits, but it's not a frequent thing. A larger project, just by necessity, would probably have greater impacts, and smaller projects would have correspondingly fewer impacts. But depending on the type of project, of course, a road, for instance, can be widened or narrowed in the area of wetlands to try and avoid. We'll see a lot of times a steeper slope and some guardrail in the wetland, where in the upland the road may be much wider and softer slopes. So there's a lot of things that can be done to minimize impacts and still get the road constructed. All of our work, since our permit decision is a federal action, then our permitting decision has to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, which is the umbrella environmental law in our nation. And so every decision we make has to be compliant with NEPA, yes. I think everyone's preference is to start a permitting process as early as possible in the project's life, in the project's development, so that we can reach a permit decision in a timely fashion and not hold up the construction of a project. But the time required for the permit decision process is really dependent on the scope of the project itself. A large interstate project is going to be much more involved and complicated, may have lots more alternatives that get looked at. A really short project, maybe a lane addition, is much more cut and dried, perhaps. So it depends.
Is the permitting process the same as the mitigation process?
Well, actually, no. The mitigation process is part of the permitting process, and literally, I'm glad you asked that because I might not have even remembered to mention it. But in order to get a permit for environmental impacts, part of the permit application is how would these impacts be mitigated. And so mitigation is built into the process and is part of the permit decision.
And explain mitigation.
Mitigation literally is a way that environmental losses in one area can be compensated by some environmental gains in a very close nearby area. So if we had an acre of wetland impact in the project location, we might replace a certain amount of wetland area nearby to offset that loss. And so that literally is the meaning of mitigation.
Are there wetlands back there around Common Commerce Parkway?
There are. In fact, there are several acres of wetlands in the project's original alignment, and some of those were minimized and avoided. There's a stream crossing which they bridged. And so there were a number of what we call avoidance and minimization measures that went into the project design and made their project a permittable project. Certainly the nation's waters are very important for a number of reasons. Clean water, of course, is the point of the Clean Water Act, and our permitting decision process is meant to be a fair, reasonable, transparent process that balances environmental protection with the applicant's project needs. And that's what we're shooting for on every permit decision that we make.
Very